Attributes are the most important element to role-playing games. I'm not just saying that because I'm a nerd that loves numbers. Attributes are critically important because they allow the game itself to determine what a character is good at and what they're bad at. It allows the game to determine what real role the character can play in the world because it gives the capability for comparison. Those attribute systems really allow the game to assign roles, and it allows the player to customize their character and grow into new roles as they play. I have been absolutely obsessed with developing an attribute system for my own game, and today I'd like to ramble a bit about that attribute system. But this has been a rather difficult video to prepare and to actually present because the attribute system covers so many little elements of the game, and it's really interwoven with everything. So it's going to be a ramble. I'll hopefully make it so it's understandable and not overly dry. But I'd like to start off by talking about the real core philosophy I have when creating my attribute system. So my core philosophy for my game is that playing a role-playing game is an artistic endeavor. It's akin to painting a painting or sculpting a sculpture, playing a musical instrument. Playing a role-playing game means you're going to be sort of cooperating with the canvas, collaborating with the developers of the game to create some character, to tell stories in the world, to flesh out the concepts they had, like the developers had, and placed into the world, that sort of environmental storytelling. You put those stories together in your head, you give them life. And whenever you're playing a role-playing game, it is just fundamentally a work of art that you're creating. So I'm really trying to design my attribute system as the core of that and design it essentially like I am creating a set of art supplies, essentially, for the player to play with and create their own character and stories. So the attribute system itself, at the core of the game, is designed around the color wheel, where you have these primary colors, but then you're also able to mix them together and really allow for blending in order to create a unique character or a unique painting. That's sort of the core of the game, and everything else grows around that. It's the seed, if you will. So in order to do that, I have 6 primary attributes that are based on the 6 primary colors: intellect, awareness, influence, athletics, inspiration, and adaptation. And these are the core attributes of the game. I call them the aspects, just to make things clear. So these 6 aspects, each of them represents a general domain of what the character is capable of doing. But then you can blend the different domains together, blend the aspects in order to have different sorts of skills and capabilities within the game. That'll become more clear later as I actually present the mechanics in-game. But I'd like to just start off with a little bit of a discussion about what each of these 6 aspects really represent and what they're supposed to be for the character. The first thing to say, I guess, would be that they're designed to be opposites. So you'll see with intellect, it's manipulating and managing information ideas. It's really the sort of mental world, things you'd be doing like, reading books and solving puzzles and such. But then it's directly opposed to athletics, where you're manipulating and moving your body in the physical world. So with all of these, you have these sort of opposite approaches. Intellect, athletics are, pretty standard sorts of things for role-playing games, I think. But some of them are maybe a little weirder. Probably adaptation is the weirdest, I guess. But you have this setup with awareness here. Awareness is your connection to your senses and the world as it is. Really things like noticing enemies, being able to detect hidden clues or traps, finding various things in the world, uh, also dealing with like weak spots on enemies and that sort of thing. And then it's opposed by inspiration, whereas inspiration is your connection to your creativity in the world that could be. So this is really interacting with art and creating arts, crafting items, but also dealing with the divines and any kind of spiritual things within the world, having any kind of things that are not readily apparent within the world, but can be brought in by your own connection to sort of your own spirit or creativity. And then for adaptation here, it's changing your behavior and body to suit your environment. This is really enduring, difficult weather or harsh circumstance, and then being able to actually thrive within that. So if you're getting attacked or dealing with, high or low temperatures, trying to, swim, hold your breath, any of that kind of stuff that would really require adaptation, that is then opposed to influence, where you're changing the behavior of everybody else to suit you. So this is more of your charisma or personality sort of skill, where you're really dealing with like recruiting and commanding units, like companions and such, or dealing with like mercantile sorts of things. But generally, then I have these 6 core aspects that are essentially your core attributes that you'd have in other role playing games and such. But they're really designed to be blended together through the other systems. So now I'm going to move on and start showing off some of the actual mechanics for other systems in the game, like how they actually interweave with other systems. So when I actually start up the game here, if I bring up the character menu, these here, you can see them as these 6 aspects. The menu is maybe a little bit busy. There's a lot of stuff going on, but hopefully I'm able to explain stuff so it's nice and clear, and it's very much work in progress. Once I get a lot of these things kind of ossified, like solved a bit better so that they become more solid, it'll be, the UI is going to get a pretty major rework. But I start off here with the actual aspects values themselves. You see this 0 out of 0 for them. And that 0 value is essentially the baseline value for a particular aspect. And it's really conceptually designed around someone who is sort of in shape for a particular thing, but not really exceptional in any kind of way. So if you think of it for athletics, if there's someone who exercises fairly often, but not a ton, but like they generally stay in shape, they eat healthy enough, that would have an athletics of 0. If that person, takes their training more seriously, cleans up their diet further, it could go positive. And if they were to sort of slack or get injured or something, it could drop into the negatives. So that 0 is kind of this baseline. And I've set that baseline as like a kind of what you'd consider to be a competent but not exceptional human. Because after all, it is a game about adventuring and such. So you can kind of assume if someone's going to adventure, they're most likely going to be like kind of reasonably athletic. And I'm just kind of going with that as the core idea. So I will even go over here and get injured. So I'm going to step on a little platform that will kind of light me on fire and burn me. All right, so I got a burn here, and that is reducing my intellect and awareness. So you can see the actual value will drop down to negative if there's some kind of thing that is a detriment to you, and then it can also go positive. But it is this minus 10 out of 0. So this first value of it is your actual like current value, including all modifiers, and that would be like if you have some kind of injury or if you have like a piece of equipment that is improving your intellect or something like that. Um, you have that like current value, and then you have that 0 there. That is your actual base value. And the reason I have that split between the current and base value is because you actually gain experience in the particular core attributes here, these aspects themselves. So you can see with the athletics, as I'm moving around, it is slowly improving this. If I run, it will improve it a little bit faster. And if I jump, you get a nice little bonus there. So one of the great revolutions in role-playing games was when the Elder Scrolls started using skill-based experience. Rather than having a generic attribute bar, having a generic experience bar, having it so your individual skills gained experience on their own, I feel just completely changed like role-playing games what the potential of them is, because it allows you to get better at the things you actually do, which allows for this really organic growth of your character. So as you're doing something, you actually get better at that, which further encourages you to do that thing because you're now more capable with it. And I just absolutely adore that kind of system. It does have some issues though, but I think it's just an incredible way to actually present experience growth and make it feel pretty believable, but allow the player to really grow into some kind of role. And it's really neat because you also feel like you're rewarded for doing anything that happens in the world. If you pick up a weapon and swing it, you're going to get better at that. If you get attacked while you're wearing armor, you get better at that. If you read a book, you can get better at that. Like, it just makes it feel like the character and the player are rewarded for everything they do in the world and everything that happens to them as well. So you really see a character, once you've put a few hours into it, how much different they've become, and they feel unique. It's sort of like whenever you're sculpting with clay, and every press into the clay, you're leaving your fingerprints in it, and it's just absorbing every bit of kind of energy you're putting into it, all of that motion. It's actually leaving a mark. And with that kind of skill-based experience system, the character itself is that clay then, where you're consistently leaving your mark anytime you do anything in the world, because they're getting better at that particular skill. To contrast that, a more standard role-playing game system for experience is having your character just have a generic experience pool, where anything you do, whether it be a combat or a quest or picking a flower, it's still going to just give you that generic experience to this one pool. And then once you hit some milestone, you level up. That system's great too, because it allows your character to just be simple, essentially, and it allows you to kind of do the things you like most in the world, but then still translate it into the rewards that you want in the world. But it does have some issues. An extreme example would be if you took a character in World of Warcraft and leveled them entirely by picking herbs. Your character is only doing non-combat sort of actions, but you're still gaining combat abilities whenever you level up. So it just creates this kind of weird dissonance. Whereas the skill system, where you have skill-based experience, it feels really in tune with your character growth, where you're doing one thing and it's making you better at that specific thing. But it also has an issue where all of the skills, like in an Elder Scrolls game, kind of need to be balanced around each other. And it's something I really notice it in Skyrim in particular, where lockpicking, it needs to be just as large of a tree basically and have a whole bunch of perks compared to like a school of magic or like two-handed weapons or something. But then you have all these perks and they're just bad basically. So like it just doesn't feel like it really justifies its whole own skill. Part of that is just kind of like lazy or rushed perk design, but it does make it so all these skills feel like they need to be as equally useful and equally as fleshed out as each other. And that's really difficult to do. It's also an issue where it does feel like your character is organically growing at things. You pick up a mace and you swing that mace and get better at swinging that mace. But in the Elder Scrolls, it feels really weird because let's say it's a one-handed mace and you pick it up and you just become a master of it. You do that for hours and hours and become a true master of it, hit the skill level 100 with one-handed weapons. But then you pick up a two-handed mace and your skill is still level 10 and you just have no idea how to swing that weapon. So it feels pretty odd because there's no real overlap within those similar skills. And like I had said with my core attribute design, where I treat them like colors, like paints, and I want the player to be able to blend them. So it feels really odd whenever you have that kind of thing. So I'm trying to avoid that. And what I'm doing is kind of taking the middle path here. Rather than having a generic experience pool for, one experience bar that is getting filled up. Instead, you actually level up in the particular like core attributes, these aspects themselves, and you gain experience doing particular things in those aspects. So with athletics, if you're moving around, jumping, running, doing like regular attacks and such, that's the sort of stuff that'll level that up. But let's say for inspiration then, if you were to like go to a shrine and pray at it or make some kind of offering, that'll give you experience. Or if you're like admiring art, like interacting with that sort of stuff, if you are like going to a bard at a tavern and sitting down with them and like you think in Skyrim where you can like have them play a song for you or something. Like you would have them play the song, and as you sit there and eat your meal, you're actually getting some inspiration experience. That's the kind of idea with it. But also like dealing with the deities in any way and such. With adaptation, it'd be a lot of like exposure to weather as you're dealing with like survival mechanics, and also dealing with like injuries and such. That would give that. Intellect, you do various things like reading, solving puzzles, awareness, like noticing enemies, like finding hidden areas and such. Like you really notice a lot in Elder Scrolls games how they have, neat items hidden in weird little places in dungeons and such. The idea is when you find those kind of things, you actually get some awareness experience with that. So you're really encouraged with that to go around the map and try to find things. And with influence, it'd be more like dialogue related, but then also trading, giving commands to followers, that sort of stuff. But then the actual systems themselves, as you're gaining experience in these aspects, whenever you actually level up then, there's various things that happen. And I'll just go ahead and finish leveling up in athletics here. So I've now, passed that like counting number value, which means I've leveled up. And the first thing to notice is the experience here, the experience bar. All these other ones have this ×1, and this one is now to a 0.99. So that value is your... Sorry, I'm just drawing a blank suddenly. That value is your aptitude. So you have the aspects as these, 6 core attributes, and each one of them has its own aptitude. And the aptitude value is essentially just an experience modifier, but it's there to represent that different people and different characters are just naturally inclined to pick up different things faster. Obviously some people can pick up the violin, and sure that, a virtuoso still absolutely has to practice. They have to earn their capabilities. but they gain the experience at such a faster rate that, the average person is never going to get as good as they managed to get in even the course of a year. If they spend, you know, their whole life practicing it, they're just never going to gain that capability. So I wanted to have that represented so that as you're creating your character, choosing your, background and like creature type and all these various options, you're able to adjust that aptitude so you actually pick up and grow into different aspects at a different rate. So also whenever you then leveled up, you gained tokens in, there's a set of them here. You can see this for athletics is now 1 out of 1 and the others are still at 0. And then there's ones here, here, and then on another menu here. So this is kind of why I need to present a lot of different systems within this Ramble here, because these core attributes, these aspects, are fundamentally intertwined with a lot of different systems in the game. And as you level up those aspects, you are granted these tokens which you can use to customize your character and really grow into a different kind of role. So the first of those tokens I want to talk about is this attribute adjustment. So this is for adjusting kind of non-core attributes. As you are working with an RPG, you have a whole bunch of attributes, just like numeric values that you need to work with, like your movement speed and, how high you jump and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of times in RPGs, they'll have those kind of core attributes, like, say, strength and dexterity and such. Every time you get a point in one of those, it will give you a tiny little bit of an improvement in a bunch of these kind of secondary or tertiary, just other attributes. So for example, with strength, if you got 1 point of strength, it would give you like 1 more pound of carrying capacity. Maybe you'd jump 1% higher, you'd hit 1% harder with melee weapons. You just have all these various little bonuses that accrue every time you get 1 point in that core attribute. I really enjoy those kinds of systems, but I'd like to try to improve on them if I can and really try to add more customization to it. One of the first issues with those is that they often feel kind of like your character's the frog in the pot being boiled, where you are getting better over time from increasing that, strength value or whatever that core attribute is, but you don't really feel it with each level up. Because whenever you level up, you are getting a very small bonus to quite a few different things. So they just inherently have to be very small bonuses, so you just really don't notice it all that much. You'll probably notice it if you take a, high level character compared to a low level character, but it's a slow acquisition of that power. And another issue with them is, this is more particular to my game, I'm making these core attributes extremely broad. Rather than having like strength and dexterity and stamina, I just have athletics. And that means it's not really clear exactly what improving your athletics should improve for those secondary attributes. If you think about athletics overall, if you took 4 people, you could have a sumo wrestler, a rock climber, a marathon runner, and a sprinter. All 4 very athletic people, but they all have very different bodies, very different training regimens, very different capabilities. So they're all athletic, but they really express that athleticism in very different ways. So I have this attribute adjustment system so that you're able to really choose individual things or individual attribute adjustments within some particular field, some kind of aspect, the core attribute there, and pick and choose which ones to do. And for that frog boiling the pot kind of thing, because you are selecting which things you actually want to put points into, they can be larger bonuses. I'm still trying to figure out the exact amount that they should be for things. That's something that'll definitely be balanced over time. Um, but you can have like a noticeable change, like maybe a jump. You can see it's not doing too much there. If I add a little bit of jump velocity, there's a bit of a noticeable change, but I'm just going to hit a little debug thing here just to give me a bunch of points in these, just to level them up. And then if I, throw some of those points in, you can see the character's jumping way higher. So the idea is you can kind of pick a particular thing and really focus on that. I'm now jumping really high, but nothing else is really improved. I could instead put that into movement speed, and then my character is moving quite quickly, particularly if I'm sprinting. So there's just kind of more capability for customization within that particular aspect. But another thing, these things are really meant to be what you grow into. And using, the idea with like those 4 different kinds of athletes that all, train into those different things differently. Generally, people pick a sport that they're kind of built to do. Like they just have a body type that is kind of well suited to the training they're going to need to do to the kind of sport or whatever pursuit it is. And that's something that is going to be kind of turned up to 11 whenever it's a fantasy world and you have huge differences between what the actual like physiologies of the creatures are. So these actual attribute adjustments, they come from your creature type. So these are just like generic ones for kind of just a testing humanoid kind of character. But the actual things, they're coming from your creature type, like the options you're picking. So if you were, say, playing like a dwarf, they might have really good options for like carrying capacity and things that are like kind of making them tougher. But their options for improving their movement speed and jump height and stuff such would be pretty bad. Like you're not really getting good returns on those like point investments. But if you're playing an elf, maybe they're really good at like dodging and movement speed and moving through difficult terrain and stuff, but they really don't get much as far as carrying capacity. So I really want the character growth to be the main thing. So like if you do have like an elf, they grow into being an elf, like good at being an elf, basically, for lack of a better way to explain it. Rather than, most RPGs, if you pick some kind of creature type or race at the start, you just are given some set bonus where they just have like, a bonus with whatever it is, skills or attributes or something, but that never really scales with the character as they grow. But you absolutely see that in even humans, where someone who has a really stocky kind of strong build by default, if they spend a bunch of time lifting weights at the gym, they're going to be adding way more mass to themselves and like improving how much they can lift so much faster than someone that has a really slender kind of build. So I really want that to be a growth kind of thing. So it's not just that every creature type gets this static bonus. It's instead changing how that character can actually grow. Okay, so another thing with these attribute adjustments, you can see they have like this cost here. It's set up where you can have like multiple costs together. They can have like diminishing returns on them and everything. So it's a pretty fun little system that really allows you to customize things quite a bit. And it basically just needs to be fleshed out. Like, right now I'm basically just working with athletics because it's a 3D game and I just need to get movement so it's working well, basically, and get combat and such working. But the idea is there going to be a whole bunch of options, and then you can kind of gain them in different ways, potentially. Not just your creature type, you would potentially be able to add them from, your background and stuff. They could potentially add those as well. So it should be a really neat system for that character growth, particularly for adjusting things that like aren't super exciting. A lot of those just like slight movement speed benefits and that kind of stuff. Okay. So the next kind of token is the skill tokens. So these are specifically set up to allow you to learn and customize skills within the game. And before really going into exactly how those work, I want to talk a little bit about the skill acquisition process, because I think it's a really important part of that treatment as the attribute system of being like this core concept, or like core like art material, essentially like your paint set in order to make a creative character. uh, One thing that has kind of really disappointed me with Bethesda's games as they have went further and further away from having like core attributes is that they're obsessed with this idea that every character should be able to do everything. And I think that does have some benefit to it, uh, in that it just makes the game more accessible and such, but it really makes it feel like you're not really role playing anymore. Like I'll take the Mage's Guild in Skyrim as an example, where you can play through the Mage's Guild without actually casting spells. You can play it as a fighter, wear heavy armor, just wield a two-handed hammer, and just bash your way through the whole thing. And I find then I don't feel like the Archmage of the Mage's Guild whenever I'm, granted that title, because I'm not really a mage. But I also don't really feel like a fighter because I've just been hanging out with mages the whole time. I think it's really essential for a role playing game to make the player interact with other people fulfilling a similar role. I think that's a huge part of actually making you feel like you belong in the world and like you're actually doing that thing. Because it's just a kind of fundamental part of skill mastery in real life that you can't do it on your own. It has to be a collaborative process, because with any kind of skill or hobby or profession, whatever it is, there's just so much to learn and so much to discover that you can't do it within one lifetime. You need to share information with people, and you need to collaborate with others who are looking for similar kinds of information and trying to grow in a similar kind of way. And it's something Morrowind and classic World of Warcraft, I think, do really well, uh, because you're actually encouraged to talk to people who are fulfilling the same kind of role that you are. Like with classic WoW, there really aren't that many class quests for whatever particular class you're playing. Through the whole course of 1 to 60, you'll just have really a handful. So generally, you're just doing these generic quests that everyone else is doing too. But I still find that my character feels quite a bit like they are playing a particular role in the world, because you're always encouraged, well, really forced to go back to your trainers and learn from them. And whenever you're doing that, you're talking to people who are kind of thematically linked into the world. I think the Druid is by far the best example in Classic WoW, where if you're trying to learn your skills as a Druid, you need to go back to Moonglade in order to train. It's this special sacred grove, like this magical little forest realm specifically for the Druids. And even though you're doing these generic quests that every other class is doing, it still goes such a long way to making the character feel like they're an actual druid, because they have this special place in the world and they're interacting with other related characters. And then Morrowind, I think, does an absolutely incredible job with getting the player to actually interact with, like-minded characters. Uh, Largely because of their training system, which their training system has a lot of issues. Largely that it's really difficult to near impossible to level up a lot of skills without actually getting training, which, isn't ideal. But it is really neat that the training encourages you to train with specific kinds of characters. Because if you're going and looking for a trainer or looking for services that are related to the kind of stuff you're doing, like if you want to get better at block or heavy armor or something, your best bet is to go to one of the factions that does that, like the Fighters Guild, House Redoran, or the Imperial Legion. They give multiple options using those same kinds of skills. And then if you actually want to get that training, particularly at higher levels, you have to rank up within those factions, which encourages you to do quests with those factions. It's not just that you go to their particular guild hall and hang out for a while. It's that you also do their quests, and their quests are doing the sorts of things that a fighter would be doing. So it just generally feels that the character is truly playing a role in the world. And they also use the core attributes to determine if you're able to rank up in a faction or not. Like if you're trying to join into the rank up in the Fighters Guild and you don't have good enough strength and endurance, they just won't let you rank up because you're not a fighter. Why would they let you? But when it comes to Skyrim and they don't have that kind of core attribute system anymore, they've stripped that out of the game's design. There's really no way to tell if someone is a mage or not. So of course, just let that fighter be the head of the Mages Guild. All right, so now that I've got through that tangent there, these actual skills themselves are set up to be more modular. Rather than the kind of very large things that exist, like the skill trees in Elder Scrolls, they should feel kind of more like the skills you'd get in your spell book, your skill or spell book in World of Warcraft. Like it's this kind of little self-contained thing. You put it on your action bar. You can see these ones that exist here already. They're already just automatically on the action bar when the character starts. But I can go over here to the smith and, I don't have any of the faction stuff set up yet, but that whole ramble I was just on about the factions, think of the idea that this is a character related to a particular faction. And in order to actually gain more skills, I can talk to this character and then train with them. And they offer me different skills that I can train with. So I'm going to learn Fireball here. So I'll click that, and then if I look at my spellbook again, you see within the discovered skills, I now have this Fireball. Now, these discovered skills are inert. The learned skills are the ones that are actually, granting their capabilities and such. So this discovered skills panel here, this should be thought of more like your card collection. If you're familiar with Magic the Gathering, Hearthstone, any kind of card game, these are your card collection. And then the learned skills are the ones you've actually chosen to put in your deck. And in order to put it over there, you have to pay the actual cost. Just like a magic or a mana cost in Magic, this system is heavily inspired by Magic. So as I've been leveling up these aspects, I gained these skill tokens, and then I can take this Fireball and learn it. And if you look, it has now taken some of these tokens to pay its cost, and then I can take that Fireball and cast it. A little stutter because it has to compile shaders, but you have this individual thing that you then learn, and it costs those tokens. So they're very much designed to be like the skills and spells, or whatever you'd call them in World of Warcraft. I believe internally they're called spells in WoW. But it's set up to be that kind of system, but you're actually gaining these in a modular kind of way. Rather than it being class-based, you're instead going around to different factions, various sources in the world to learn these. And you can gain them from different places, but factions are the most consistent place that you're going to be able to gain them. You could also gain them from books. Maybe if you went into a tomb and you found a necromantic ritual that was being performed, you could examine that and piece together some raise dead capabilities or something like that. So there's other ways to gain these skills, but your factions and guilds and such are the most reliable thing because that really encourages the player to do things in the world that are related and interact with other characters that are related so that they really feel like they're playing that role in the world. And even if you are gaining them from other things, it's always context based. Like if you're finding something in a book, it's going to be a book that is related to that kind of skill. You know, you get a necromancy spell from that necromantic ritual that you found. But you have that particular skill. And then if I actually click it here to look at it, there's a bunch of things. we'll get to it in a second here. But it scales up with these particular aspects that are related to it. So you can see here it's got intellect and inspiration as things that it will scale up with, which means it is essentially getting more powerful from that. So you can see as a baseline, you hurl a ball of fire, causing 10 peril to the first target struck. Peril is damage, essentially. It's thematically different. I have another video about that, but just think of it as damage for the purposes of this. But you can see after I had hit a character, it did 10.046 peril. You know, it didn't do 10 exactly. And that's because I have, you know, some capability in intellect and inspiration, and that scaled up its power a little bit. But it also scaled other things to it. I have these different scaling attributes here. You know, this is another type of attribute. I have these core attributes here. I've got these kind of secondary attributes. These scaling attributes are ones that are specifically designed for skills. And they're kind of like if you think about the secondary attributes in World of Warcraft, like haste, crit chance, mastery, that sort of stuff. It's that kind of concept, basically. And they exist here directly on this skill. So you can modify them on the skill. And whenever you're improving these aspects that are related to this particular skill, it is improving this all scaling. All scaling is going to, it just improves all these other ones. So like, okay, so just a way to show it off, I guess. To start things off, I allow you to customize the skill a bit more. So I'm just going to put some negative ranks into a few of these things here and put them into power scaling. You know, if this is kind of like a point buy thing, like you can decrease ranks in order to put ranks into another thing. So like the default peril or damage this fireball causes is 10. I've increased the power scaling. Whenever I cast this fireball, and the cast time is slower now, but it did, you know, 20.54. So it hit essentially twice as hard because I have this extra power scaling in here. But let's say I want to drop the power scaling and instead improve the speed scaling. And I'm going to hold Alt and click so it'll go, it's putting 5 points at a time, make it a little faster. But now with speed scaling improved, see the cast time is way faster. But I dropped my power scaling in order to do that, so it did less peril, less damage. But I also have these other ones, like the range scaling is determining like how far out the fireball actually shoots. As you can see, it just kind of drops pretty quick. But if I take those, you know, throw them into this instead, it's back to having a longer cast time, but it really flies out quite a bit further. So you have these scaling attributes that allow you to directly customize the skill so that it is working a little bit differently. And you can take this skill, it's sort of like with WoW, if you took like the talents that you can get in the tree and everything and kind of just jam them directly onto the skill, or if you took like the Morrowind spell customization system and just had that directly on the skill itself, it's kind of that concept. And you, by default, you're able to pull these ranks off in order to improve the other things, just as kind of a way to allow you to customize things a bit from the start. But one of the other things here is if you go and get more training, or if you find other ranks somewhere in the world, you're actually improving your ranks with the skill. So like you can see it's got 1 right here. I'm just going to spam click it a few times. You see the ranks are going up. And that is giving me more of this adjustment token resource, which means I can then put that directly into these things to scale the skill up itself. So the skill scales passively by default as you're improving these aspect values, but then it is also something as you're gaining ranks of it, you're able to customize it more. What's better to talk about next? I guess another way you can modify these things, these skills, is with more skill tokens. Rather than just purchasing more and more skills, you can actually put more of these skill tokens you've earned from leveling up the aspects to change the behavior of the particular skill. So typically, as I've been, hitting someone with this fireball in a very anticlimactic fashion, it just disappears, causes some peril to them, and that's it. It's pretty bland. It's going to stay bland, honestly. I've not went in and made neat particle effects for it and everything. But instead of disappearing immediately, I put into this sticky fireball, and then whenever it hits someone, it sticks to them and it keeps ticking some damage. And then it eventually disappears. And with a little tooltip here, the fireball sticks to the target for 1 second per rank and continues to burn them for 10% of the initial impact's damage each second. So you'd see I have 3 ranks into it, and each of those ranks takes 1 more intellect skill token, and see the actual fireball was costing 5 now here instead of the 2 it normally did. So you can put those points into that. Then I can also put into this detonation. The fireball explodes when it expires, causing 10% per rank of the impact's peril to all creatures within 5 meters. So now it does fire out, and also you can fire it into the ground and stuff as well. See, it sticks around for a little bit, and then it explodes. And it hits everything around. And like that range, it says 5 meters, but that, I don't know how well it came across, but there was a circle, like a sphere that it worked with. That's getting scaled up by this range scaling. So all of these other little things that you're customizing on it can also be, scaling up as well. So you see there's this little sphere, everything within that gets hit. So yeah, you have this particular skill. I'm really trying to combine the spell creation system from Morrowind and then also the options that you would get with a talent tree and such, and the skill ranks that you get in classic WoW, take all of that stuff and combine it so it's on the particular skill. So it's maybe a little bit weird to look at. I don't know. I'm used to dealing with really complex UIs between Unreal and Blender and Rider and everything all the time. So I don't know if this is too fiddly for people, but it allows you to have a whole bunch of customization, and it hopefully avoids some of the issues that Morrowind spell creation has had. I really, really adore spell creation in Morrowind, and I think it's a great thing for the game, but it definitely had some major issues in that it lets you break the game way too easily. Which I think it's okay to be able to break a game, but it kind of sucks that you always have to try to not break the game once you know how to break it. So it allows things to be a little more balanced within themselves. I don't know, but still gives you quite a bit of capability to customize things. And then it lets you, another thing with Morrowind, you could customize the spells quite a bit and make your own kind of custom thing, but they also weren't actually that unique because you're just affecting these different parameters, so those kind of base parameters, yeah, you can tweak those, but then you're also then able to add specific stuff that is directly related to just this spell, like the detonation effect, the sticky fireball effect, and that kind of stuff. So there's just a lot more customization that can exist within a particular skill. But they're kept, more self-contained. Something I had forgotten to mention as well with the scaling. You see there are the intellect and inspiration are two that it scales with, the two aspects that it scales with as you're improving with them, but it also has this little enchanting symbol here. And that enchanting symbol is one of these proficiencies. So these proficiencies are kind of similar to like the skills in Dungeons and Dragons, where you have, a big list of them, and then you're able to get better at like skill checks and stuff by improving them. It's a kind of similar thing here. So I guess maybe I'll just set up as like a demo. Maybe this is too much screwing around. Where am I at? Yeah, that should be fine. So this should be doing a little bit more than 10 peril, just because I have a little bit. So it hits for that 10, and then it ticks 3 times, and then it explodes. So like everything's checking out with like how many ranks I have of this sticky and detonation stuff, and I'm actually gonna get rid of those just so it's less numbers. But I'm getting a little bit extra, so it's not just like 10, it's 10.051 because I have the intellect and inspiration. But this also scales with enchanting. So if I put some points in enchanting here, that will also scale up. See, so now it's 11. So these give more of a benefit than the aspects do, because the aspects are really designed to be very generic. So they're scaling all of your capabilities up a little bit, but it's not scaling a huge amount on everything. These proficiencies are much more specific, but whenever they do come into play, they'll give more of a benefit. So also what this is doing, like these scaling things, they're just giving to all scaling here, which is just improving everything across the board. So like your efficiency is scaling is improved, so your spell is gonna cost less. You're gonna have better crit chance on it. Like it's gonna hit harder, fly further, and cast faster for this particular spell. But another thing these proficiencies and aspects do, I just said they're kind of similar to the skills in D&D. It's the actual aspect checks here, competence checks. So like if I have this spike trap and I walk over it, so you can see this fail. I rolled a 54 and I needed an 80, and I failed it, so I took some peril. But I click that for the actual competence check result. This is just like a debug thing. It's not really meant to be presented to the player, so it's just, don't worry about it. But you can see it's using these different aspects. And basically what's happening, it's taking your aspect value, like your current value, including the modifiers and everything. It's taking that and then taking those and also getting modifiers from your proficiencies that are related to the particular thing, doing like a random roll and rolling against difficulty. So it's extremely similar to like a skill check or saving throw in Dungeons and Dragons. And that's a huge thing that these aspects and proficiencies are doing. And if I take this thieving proficiency here and do another step over this, see I passed that time, you can see it was getting a big bonus from thieving, or like every point that I have in thieving is actually giving me a +3 to my chance to succeed. So you end up getting, a whole lot of value there. You can see all of my values are turning negative now, like they're going red because they're starting to diminish from whatever their base value is. That's because I need to go to bed. I'll head over to the inn here, but I'm exhausted right now because you can see my energy here. As I've been casting this fireball, it's burning energy. You can see it's got this energy cost of 5, and then also like my efficiency is bad right now, so it's costing 25% more, even like or it's basically just costing more. That is, there's other stuff involved, but it's costing more, which is burning through my energy really quick. So I'm just gonna sleep for a minute here, get my energy back up, and also sleeping remedied my mishap here, so that penalty is gone. Make my bed here, and then okay. So speaking a little bit about the factions again, that kind of concept that the skills you're trying to get, you have an incentive to go to them. You have an incentive to go to particular trainers, particular factions, do specific stuff in the world that's related to the kind of character you want to be playing. I really think of it too that like these aspects are kind of the core of the lore as well as the character. Like mechanically, these are the core values that really represent what your character is able to do, but they're also the core of the actual lore of the game and how I want to design the world and the factions. And it's really heavily inspired by Magic the Gathering, where they have the different mana colors. And then all of their different like legendary creatures and factions and such in the game represent those different colors. And I think one of the coolest things is Ravnica, where they have this whole plane where there are specific guilds, and they basically just took every 2-color combination that exists. So like red green, red blue, red white. You just go through and figure out all the color combinations that can exist with all the colors they have, and then just decide, okay, we need to make a faction for each one of these, based on its identity, what kind of mechanics we have in the game and such. How should that faction behave? What should their characters be like? What should their lore be like? What should their art be like? So I'm really envisioning this with that same kind of concept. So you have these particular aspects, and then they're how the player can paint their own character and create this as this creative process. But it's also how I then paint the world and try to figure out how everything kind of blends together. So I think it just ends up being a fun way to actually design those. And I think it's really important to actually root those core attributes into the game in a really interwoven kind of manner. Okay. So with these skills, you see all these ones so far have just been actions. And I guess I should mention that a lot of these like basic things you'd be able to do are themselves skills, so they themselves can get modified in a similar way. They're not fully fleshed out yet, but they have this like basic scaling in place, like the fireball does. But then they're also going to have their additional options, like how fireball has these special options that use additional skill tokens. These other kinds of things, like your dodging and jumping and attacking and all that kind of stuff, they could then also have skills kind of put into them to really make them work differently. But there are those actions, like the things you actually put on the action bar, you activate them, they do something. But then there's some different kinds of skills as well. The crafting skills I am not ready to present. They just need a lot of work still. It's using these same similar kinds of concepts though. Like that kind of knowledge system with the skills where you're gaining different ranks. You can do that with different recipes essentially that you'd be crafting within the skills. And then you also have the ability to adjust them and such. Like they're just not really ready to present yet. But the passive skills, these are something that are, pretty fine to present. So one example here is well-rounded. I'm just going to click a few different ranks of it. and present that. So this is one that takes all of the different skill tokens, takes one of each, and I can just switch it over here to learned, and then you'll see I'm getting a green benefit now. Like I now have a bonus to all of these, and also all of my proficiencies are getting 1. So well-rounded is set up so that whenever your highest aspect and lowest aspect are within like 5 points of each other, you get benefits across the board to all of your aspects and to all of your proficiencies. So the idea is you are gaining experience doing these various things, like you're running around, jumping and stuff. You're reading books, finding enemies, all these kinds of different things that you're doing. If you're able to keep them still within a similar range to each other, you're getting some benefit across the board, and that's going to make you, if you're having all of these proficiencies better, all of these aspects better, all of your skills are going to scale up higher. You're going to be doing better at those competence checks, like, if you're running over traps or doing whatever it is. But like if you, say, get too good at awareness, you eventually get out of that range. They're not close enough to each other anymore. You're no longer well-rounded. So that kind of goes away. But as you have these different adjustment tokens you're getting from leveling up the ranks of this, you can, make the range bigger. So now you see it's within 6 instead of 5. But then you can also make the aspect value better, the proficiency better. So just generally, you're able to customize these. And the passive skills are really designed to not scale passively, because like the active skills, you can kind of snapshot whenever they're actually going to calculate your attributes and everything. But the passive skills, it would be weird, to say the least. Like this one, for instance, you'd end up getting into like an infinite loop because you would want to calculate what the aspect values are, and then based on how high the aspect values are, you're giving yourself a larger and larger bonus. But then they would keep buffing itself, and it would just get into an infinite loop. So like, yeah, just generally passive skills are supposed to work differently. They're really kind of your passives. You still customize in the same kind of way. You're still gaining the different ranks and everything. But yeah, they're just a little bit different. Okay. Just thinking what I've forgot. A couple of things I did not, that I've neglected to mention here. This base value for your, like you have your kind of your current that includes modifiers, then you have that base value. The base value never goes down. Like you can't lose experience in something. If you get, like if I run over and get burned again or something, my current value can break, or like I can, change this so I'm out of range or something, I can lose that. But the base value never changes, because that's kind of representing how much experience you've gained. So it just doesn't, you just can't drop it. And then also you notice these are dropping over time. These aptitude values, that is because every time you level up one of these, you lose like 0.01. So it'll be like, this is an experience multiplier. So like right now, as I do athletic things, I'm getting 89% of the experience I was getting whenever I had just started, because I've leveled up a few times. And this generally parallels what you normally experience in an RPG, where you have, diminishing returns on how quickly you'd level, and just represents how skills just generally start to be slower to improve as you get better at them. I figure I might as well mention that. So moving on to the next of the tokens that you gain as you're leveling these aspects, it is these ones here. These are called activation tokens. And these are a specific resource that you're able to use for like impressive abilities, or to do specific things in the world that would really tire your character out. So if I speak to another trainer here over at the temple, I'm going to pick up a few ranks of this healing totem and go ahead and learn that healing totem. So healing totem, you can see here, it has that energy cost, but it also has this inspiration activation token cost. So I'll put the healing totem on my action bar here, and this just kind of drops a really poorly made version of like the healing stream totem in Warcraft for Shaman. But you can see I have 10 out of 10 of these inspiration activation tokens. I use it, and now there's this little fancy totem here that is restoring my luck over time, and it burned one of those inspiration activation tokens. So those just get diminished by using this. So these activation tokens are sort of a shared resource that really powerful abilities are able to utilize, on top of using like energy, luck, balance, and breath. I can also use these activation tokens to kind of limit how many of those you can really utilize. And I don't have a good method to present it right now, but they are also utilized for specific things that you might keep on you and such. Like, let's say you equip plate armor, like really heavy armor. That itself is exerting your character. Like, that is a feat, just being able to move around in that at all and adventure in that. So that could actually deplete some of these athletics tokens, these activation tokens, just from having that heavy armor equipped. Same kind of thing if you had like a powerful, magical staff or something you're using, it could be using that. Various like activated abilities on equipment. It could be something that you go and there's like a boulder blocking your path, and you can kind of do an athletics check and potentially use up the activation tokens in order to get that out of the way. So they're just kind of this, like, one of the ways I can measure how the character is kind of exerting themselves and getting depleted as they're continuing on through their adventure. And also they can gate specific things. So like maybe you can't have a whole bunch of powerful magic items on yourself right at the start because you're just not really qualified to use them all. So they can be using the activation token and kind of like filling slots in a way by using those up. But then you can also have different gates on them saying like, well, you just can't use this at all unless your intellect is at least, 10 or whatever it is. But also say if you want to like recruit companions, something I've really always like, it kind of bugs me in all Bethesda's games. Like, I really love having companions, but they also feel insanely powerful for basically no trade-off. Like you're just kind of handed companions, and then they don't die, they don't like use any resource from you, they don't want like a share of the loot, but you just are just handed them as like a quest reward, or like handed them, like you give them like 1,000 gold, like some really small amount, and then they'll just follow you into the gates of hell, and they just don't want anything out of it. So like, and they're so powerful that they're just a huge benefit. But this, you can use like influence tokens to kind of say how big your party can be, where it's like, oh, if I want to recruit this really powerful character, maybe it's going to take like 10 influence tokens, or maybe they're using different kinds of tokens. It's not necessarily just influence, but that's kind of like one of the core fundamental things that influence does. It allows you to recruit other characters. At least it will be able to once I flesh that out. But with these tokens, I've been casting this healing totem, kind of use up those particular things, and then I can go ahead and rest. And that was actually it's like, oh shit, is that a bug for a second? But no, it was actually good, and it gives me another thing I can present with that. So I had those 10 activation tokens. The third time I cast the healing totem, it did not use the token, and that is actually because of the efficiency scaling. So efficiency scaling reduces the costs of like energy costs and such, but it also has a chance to make it so you don't use the actual tokens. And that's just, it has to be a chance because it's an integer value and the other ones are a float value, so it's easier to modify. And that's beside the point. But I was just looking at it for a second, like, oh shit, is there a bug there? But no, everything's working as it should. Okay, so these can all get modified in this kind of way and everything. But another reason that actually reminds me too, I have this 10-second cooldown here, and I drop it down. You can see there's a cooldown. I need to work on the UI element of this, but you can see the animating thing that's moving around. But one of the reasons too I want to do these activation tokens instead of just doing everything through cooldowns and such, because I don't really want people to just blow all their cooldowns on a fight and then just go AFK for a couple minutes, let everything recharge, and then go into the next room and fight the next set of creatures. I kind of just really prefer that your character actually does get worn down over time. I think those kinds of mechanics really make a game a lot more interesting. I really favor durability and kind of depletion mechanics so that you're really treating any kind of dungeon not just as a tactical fight, but also a logistical fight where you have to get through some of these creatures efficiently in order to really save your energy and capabilities for the harder fights, instead of just being able to dump everything. So I think those are kind of like an extra important layer in order to make it so you have more of these resources to manage. So it really matters that you're effectively fighting these smaller creatures. Because it's something with Skyrim, if the enemy doesn't kill you, it probably just doesn't matter, because like your health refunds passively, so does your mana and everything. So like it really doesn't matter if the enemy hit you a few extra times, because you're just going to regenerate it passively. But if you actually, like if the damage is sticky, like they have hit you, you now have to actually expend resources to heal that up. Which is one of the reasons I have this healing totem actually use these activation tokens, because it's a healing kind of thing. So like the damage is sticky, you now actually have to spend some kind of resources to heal it up. You have to make trade-offs and really consider what's worth doing. I think that just ends up making things feel a lot more interesting. Even when some of the battles are easier, there's still a reason to try to masterfully complete those fights. Because there's a real benefit. You've saved some kind of resource. Okay. So, on to the fourth and final kind of token. So I'm starting to lose my voice here. I'm not used to speaking so often. These are style tokens on this different styles panel here. Pardon me. So styles are essentially a container for your actual skills, and they're really designed to represent a whole way of fighting or a way of doing whatever it is you're up to. I think something that's really enjoyable, like, I love like old martial arts movies and anime and stuff where they're trying to hone their style and like go off to learn with some master in order to improve some particular capability, like this one move or something, whatever it is. But I think that kind of thing is really interesting, and I think it also has a ton of potential for actual customization and character growth. So I really have that as a main focus in the game. And kind of the inspiration of the system is World of Warcraft's stance system. So with WoW, you have, let's say, a warrior. They have like defensive stance and battle stance and berserker stance. You have these different stances you can swap to that really allow your character to behave differently, because you have access to different skills, but it also gives you some different passives that are going to change kind of what the stance is for. Like defensive stance, you take less damage, but you also deal less damage, but you generate more threat, so you can make enemies attack you. So it's just really good for tanking and really changes how you're going to play your character. But then it also gives you access to different skills. And I think that kind of stance thing is really interesting, where you switch between those stances and it changes your action bar because it simultaneously makes your character less complex because you have more or you have less things on your action bar at any given time, but it also makes it more complex because now you really have to consider if it's worth switching into this different stance in order to gain access to these particular skills or whatever the passives are. Like druid shapeshift forms in WoW fall into that same kind of category, and they're, really important to this kind of design. Uh, but they make PvP as a druid so interesting in WoW because you really have to consider which form you're in at any given time. And, swapping into one form is going to totally change how your character behaves. So your character just feels incredibly complex, but it's just like wildly interesting to play with that kind of stance setup. I love any of the classes in WoW that use that because it really just adds this whole extra layer of depth that you just don't experience in games typically. So the styles themselves are really designed to do that kind of thing. And you can see here, I have this Versatile 1 and Versatile 2, these two different styles. And this Versatile 1 is highlighted because that is the style that is currently active right now. And if I tap F, it switches into Versatile 2, and it has nothing on the action bar. If I try to, like, none of my abilities do anything. And, like, you can see even, like, my jump ability is on this. I can jump, but I guess you have to take my word for it. I'm hitting the jump key. I'm hitting spacebar. It's not even jumping. Because all that stuff is tied into this particular style that you're in. So you can see these styles. They work in the same way over here with, like, learned and then discovered, just like the skills do. So you can actually gain different ranks in the styles and then customize them. So if I click this Versatile 1, again, it's kind of busy. It's got a lot of stuff going on and just like a lot of numbers, list of numbers. Maybe it's, I don't know, but it's applying the same kinds of concepts, but it's applying it to all of your skills. So those scaling attributes that you'd see on that fireball, these apply to every skill that you have set here. So with this, I can modify this particular style. I can do the same kind of thing where I'm like, I can drop a few points initially, just have a little bit more to play with at the start. And I have it set so you can just do 5 ranks off of things. That's kind of the default, but it could be some different amount. But like, I just did that. So now everything I'm doing, this would include the fireball and the healing totem and all of these other things like jumps and attacks and everything. They're a little less efficient, so I'm just depleting more energy and such as I'm doing these things. But they're now just more powerful. It's like I'm hitting harder with the fireball. I'm healing more with the healing totem, that kind of concept. So it's just across the board. But then, you can see it has none of these skill tokens to start, but I can use that same kind of concept and say, I want my all scaling to improve just with intellect. And you see the actual cost of it is now advancing and depleting from my actual pool of tokens. So now any skill that I would be using that is using intellect as like its colors, like the fireball is now getting extra scaling, meaning it's doing all of these things a bit better. But that is not applying to this healing totem because this one's inspiration only. It doesn't have that intellect cost in it. So you could have these different styles and really design them for different purposes. So like it's not like this particular one, I guess the way I'd say it, this one is specifically designed to be versatile. This is like the base style that a character is supposed to start with, and you can really move it in any direction you want, but you might want to split things up even. So like this Versatile 1, you might want to be for like long range stuff. You have a lot of your like intellect and awareness and stuff set into that. Maybe things get close, you switch to versatile 2. Now it's more like melee combat stuff. You improve your capability with athletics and everything. So you're really always choosing where to put those particular points. And then you can add more styles. So like I can go in this discovered and I can just right click it, not left click it. And it is a whole extra one that I can put points into. And I believe this is the guy that has ranks of styles. So I can train with him. And so he's got that versatile style. I'll grab some points of that. See, I now have, extra points, and those points are applied to every one of these. So like, I can just go kind of across the board and improve them in different ways. But the idea is these ones are free, just like these kind of base skills here. They start off free because I just want to grant them to the character as your baseline thing, but they don't start with any like skill token cost. But then you can add stuff to modify them later on. But then this versatile one is really designed for anything, but you could have other styles that are designed for much more specific stuff, like the shapeshifts in Warcraft. Sadly, I have like no progress in this yet. It doesn't do anything, but it's just a placeholder so I can talk about and show that that's the concept. Like you can have different shapeshift forms. Hopefully I can accomplish that. I've got a pretty good idea of how to do it, but it's going to be complicated, so we'll see. But, doing those kind of things, you have like shadow form. You could have like a pyromancy kind of style. It's like a baseline thing. It has very different kinds of adjustment options to it, but maybe it would make it so kind of any non-pyromancy or like fire-related skill would be worse, or it would completely lock you out of different schools of magic, but then you would be really, really good using those specific fire things. So I don't really know how this style thing is going to develop overall, honestly, but I really like the idea of having this container that really determines, kind of a global change on what those particular skills are going to be doing, like being able to modify them all. Because I just love in those kind of martial arts movies where you have the two warriors like circling around each other slowly, and they're just changing their stance as they're eyeing each other up, changing the way they're holding their weapon, trying to find the right angle of attack, anticipating what the opponent might do. I just think that's such a dramatic moment of storytelling within those movies, and I want to try to get that kind of capability in the game. And I think just even from what I've experienced in WoW, where the styles and stances and such allow your character to be both complex and simple at the same time, because it really condenses your action bar, but gives you a lot of extra decisions to make. It just really makes things a lot more interesting. So you have those actual styles themselves, but then another thing you can use to adjust them and use up these skill tokens or style tokens are tactics. So tactics, I'll just use an example here, or grab a couple example ranks. The tactics are things that have both upsides but also downsides, so you wouldn't necessarily want to apply them to every style, but they're kind of like a modifier you can hook onto a style. So I have this versatile style here, this main one that I'm working on. I can learn this defensive tactic, and then I can basically pin it onto this. So now it is actually taking effect, but it would not be taking effect if I'm using a different tactic. I can't really show that super well other than like a debug window at the moment. But it works. You just have to trust me. But the idea with these is that they always have some kind of downside to them, but it's a kind of thing that you would just be able to train in and gain capability in, and then it would be able to apply to really anything you're doing. So defensive here what this does, it just increases your peril resistance, which is like your damage resistance, but it also reduces your power scaling. So you're just going to basically be hitting less hard. So this is very similar to like the defensive stance for warrior in World of Warcraft, where you're doing less damage, but you're taking less damage. It's the same kind of concept here. You wouldn't want that all the time as a warrior, but having it as this tactic means I can kind of take that tanking stance kind of concept and then allow you to pin it to any style that you make. Right now it doesn't increase threat generation, but I also want to do that kind of thing. So it's the idea that you could kind of take any style and further customize it beyond like the actual customization it has itself, but then pin a particular tactic to it that is going to make it automatically work as like a tanking style, because now it generates more threat, takes a little bit less damage. But there's always this downside to it, so maybe you don't always want to do it. So you can just kind of take these and just like pin and unpin them to a particular style, and then this one's not fully fleshed out. Like I want to do more options for it, but they're just always kind of using that concept where you're able to just kind of pin it on there and then change the way the whole thing works. So it's just a pretty odd system. There's a lot of different ways to customize your character and really allow them to grow into something different. And my hope is that you're going to be encountering, different skills as you're leveling up, and you can't really plan your path, but you have to adapt to it. You can get a general idea of what kind of character you want from the beginning at character creation when you're choosing your background and traits and such, what kind of creature type you are. But then you have to grow from there. So I really see it with a lot of this acquisition of these different ranks for the styles, the tactics, the skills, that, it's not like World of Warcraft or something where you pick your class and then you can kind of figure out your talent build before you've even started leveling up, and you just kind of know what your character is going to be. Instead, you're exploring and discovering these things and gaining these rewards and advancing your character. And then you just kind of have to adapt because you have these particular points. I happen to be doing these things that leveled up my influence really well, and I have these few things to spend on them, like these discovered skills. Maybe I'll go into this, and you just really kind of grow into the character. And what I had said before about the Elder Scrolls really making it more of like a clay kind of feeling, where every mark is left in your character as you're doing these different things. I just really want to take that to an extreme and push that and iterate that and kind of see how far I can go, so that you're really starting with some kind of seed at character creation and then growing the character from there, and really always telling the story of your character as they're evolving, and really choosing how they grow, because you just have a lot of different options available to you. So I've hopefully made the case that the attribute system for a game is critically important. And when it's really interwoven into the gameplay and into the systems, it can really enhance the creativity of the player and allow for a very customized experience. This is a long ramble. I mean, hopefully I covered everything I was planning to cover. I really appreciate you listening, and I'd also very much appreciate feedback. So thank you very much.